When I was an adolescent, I read On the Beach by Neville Shute, which is a book about nuclear war that occurred by accident, and everyone in the Northern Hemisphere died, and the only people left alive were people in Melbourne, which is where I lived. And it was just an ordinary story of ordinary families, and gradually the radiation came down, and the people had their last gin and tonic at the Melbourne Club, you know, and the government dispensed cyanide capsules so that people could kill their babies immediately and not die in distress with acute radiation sickness. And at the end of the book, the beautiful, elegant streets of Melbourne were still there with the trams and St George slaying the dragon outside the public library, bits of paper blowing down in the breeze, a blind gently flapping, and that was the end of life on Earth, or the human race. And that branded my soul. Because when you're an adolescent, all I could think about was falling in love and, you know, smelling the orange blossom, and everything's just fantastic. And things changed, and because of curious disposition, I read every article I could find, of course, then on nuclear weapons. And at the time, Russia and America were going hell for leather testing in the atmosphere, and there was a lot of fallout. And scientists were saying children would get leukemia and the like. And then physicists started to join them. And I knew Jerry Wiesner, who was a very eminent physicist who worked in the Manhattan Project, who was Jack Kennedy's science advisor. And women used to wait outside the White House all the time saying children are going to get leukemia and cancer from the fallout. And Jack was apparently standing at the White House windows with his arms behind his back, and it was raining. The rain was falling on the windows, and he said, "You mean, Jerry, there's radiation in that rain?" And he said, "Yes, Mr. President." Because cancer takes so long to develop, we are now seeing the results from the fallout. They absolutely dust North America with radiation, absolutely doused it. That's why most males in the Northern Hemisphere have a tiny load of plutonium in their gonads, because it's still coming down from the weapons testing days, and still will for the rest of time, virtually. And then, so I tried to speak at the university to my colleagues, and they'd just look up from the poker games and say, "What's that mad Sheila talking about?" So I knew that wouldn't work. Then I went to live in America from 66 to 69, and it was during the time that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. I got up one morning and saw him lying bleeding to death on the television. Martin Luther King was killed, the anti-Vietnam War movement, Nixon was elected. I mean, and it was a time of turmoil, but I saw a democracy in action. People were really outraged. And I went back to Australia, which everyone's frightfully nice, and, you know, it's democracy kind of. And then, oh yeah, then I read Germaine Greer, The Female Eunuch, which changed my life, because I realised I could really speak my truth, and I didn't have to please anyone anymore. I can just be totally honest. And then someone leaked some radiation results from the Adelaide water, that the level of radiation was 1,500 picocuries per litre, because the French were blowing up bombs in the Pacific. So I was asked to speak. I wrote a letter to the paper, and they didn't publish it. And I rang up the editor and said, "Where is it?" And he said, "Well, madam," very condescending, "we get hundreds of letters a day." And I said, "Yeah, but mine's important." He published it, and that night I was on television. Well, of course, I didn't know everything. I was a young doctor, rusty general practitioner, 3 babies, and I didn't know everything. And of course, by making mistakes, that's how you learn. That's how we learn in medicine, by making mistakes. That's how you learn in life, you know. An old woman was dying, and they said, "What would you have done differently?" She said, "I would have made more mistakes." So I learnt, and I was attacked by the head of nuclear medicine at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, hysterical woman, Dr. Yak Yak. But it turned out the Australians don't like the French. They think they're really arrogant. And they said, "What are those bloody French doing down here? Frogs dropping their bombs." And so they stopped buying French perfume, French wine, French cheese. The mail workers wouldn't deliver French mail. And whole pages of letters to the editor were about the bloody French. Well, and spontaneous marches occurred in the streets in the weekends, with men with babies on their shoulder with signs saying, "I don't want to die of leukemia," from the French tests. And then Gough Whitlam got elected and was forced by public opinion to take France with New Zealand to the International Court of Justice, and she was forced to test underground. So I saw what Jefferson said: an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. Then I worked with the miners and helped to stop uranium mining. And then I moved to America and founded Physicians for Social Responsibility. And because at the time I went there, most Americans in '78 said it's better to be dead than red. And I said, what, you'd rather die than... Yeah, we don't want to be communists. So I said, well, what about the pygmies in Africa? Yeah, they don't want to be communists either. Gradually, over time, the American people were starting to say, nuclear war's bad for our health. And we were saying it will create the final epidemic. And then I was asked to the annual morticians meeting. And I said, why do you want me to speak to you? And they said, we don't want to have to embalm radioactive bodies. And I said, don't worry, you'll be one yourself. Anyway, they passed a resolution against it. And I talked to the Southern Baptists and I talked about Jesus. And, you know, we mobilised 80% of Americans to oppose nuclear weapons. I met with Reagan for an hour and a quarter in the White House. He knew nothing. I corrected him because I'd just written Missile Envy. And he'd get very uptight and anxious, so I held his hand. So I held his hand about half the time. So we quickly established a doctor-patient relationship where I could assess his IQ, and you have to assess patients' IQ to make sure they put their suppository in at the right time in the morning and all that stuff. And I came out and his IQ was about average 100, which means half the people are below 100 and half the people are above. And I also said I thought he had impending Alzheimer's, and that diagnosis was correct. It was a very frightening experience, but I think through the retrospectoscope, he started to say after that, nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. And he started working with Gorbachev. And Gorbachev and Reagan met for a weekend in Reykjavik in '87, and they almost agreed to abolish nuclear weapons. Two mere mortals, over a weekend, almost agreed. So I saw again the power of education. And that's what we must do. Yes, we have to have demonstrations, but if the woman, Mrs. Brown, going into the supermarket, loading up her trolley with 3 kids behind her with Coke cartons and stuff, doesn't know what we said tonight and the dangers of plutonium and living near reactors, then we're nowhere. We are nowhere. I like unions. They're the salt of the earth, and I was able to persuade the Australian unions to stop mining uranium for 5 years. Because I'm a doctor, you're able to talk about any bodily organ with a professional manner, and I sort of got them hooked by talking about the effects of radiation upon their testicles. And Australian workers don't really care about much except beer and stuff, but they did. That really got them. So it was very effective till we got a very bad Prime Minister called Bob Hawke, who came in and said, well, because Australia's got 40% of the world's richest uranium, and the uranium that's now fissioning in Fukushima is almost certainly Australian uranium, so we're killing people. And I left after the 5-year, or during the 5-year ban on uranium mining. They wouldn't mine it, transport nor export it, and I went to America and kind of led the movement there against nuclear weapons. And now people don't remember what radiation means, how it causes mutations, or how it causes cancer and the like. They've forgotten. And the media, mostly dominated by one Rupert Murdoch, is not interested in telling the truth about the medical consequences. Everyone's frightened about nuclear power, and war, because of the medical consequences. But we get these awful pro-nuclear people on television, BBC and stuff, and they're physicists and engineers or businessmen, and they know little or nothing about radiation biology or how radiation causes disease.